and welcome to everybody to hear Sarah's story. It was fascinating watching who was coming in, some people from other parts of my life, but also one or two descendants of Sarah, including my husband and Richard, my eldest son Richard, they are listening in, and John Gurney, who is from another branch of the family, but a descendant of Sarah too. And there may be others lurking that I don't know about. We'll see. So Sarah, the Sarah I'm talking about, was the great grandmother of my husband Nicholas, and we knew very little about her until a few years ago. Her second marriage was to a very complex character called John Tawell, and it only lasted 4 years, that marriage, and ended quite dramatically in 1845. He murdered his mistress, was caught by the newly installed electric telegraph, found guilty, and hanged in public. So you can understand why the family didn't talk about this very much until the more recent generations, when more has been learned about it. And just to say about the Quaker bit, John Tawell as a young man became a Quaker, but only lasted a year in membership because he married out. And for the rest of his life, he tried to be a Quaker. And when he was in the news, he was billed as the Quaker murderer. I don't think Quakers are very approving of that at the time, of course. So it was a very well-reported event, and articles are still being written about it today. It turns out from my research that actually Sarah was the real Quaker, although her membership was quite varied. So in this presentation, I may have to vary it a bit because we have friends from Earl's Cole meeting, which comes at the end, and I want to make quite sure we include that, and welcome to them. And what else? Yes, I'm including some of the issues that I came upon during the research, just so that, because it's quite good to share, and you can see where my mistakes were as well, perhaps. So now to share screen. Now, Pat, you would be my help here. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's just...
And it's just a single slide, is it?
A single slide, yeah, that's fine.
Excellent. So some of you may have read in 2013 the article I wrote about the Quaker murderer John Tawell and his second wife Sarah, which was in Quaker Connections number 59. So this is really a sequel to that because I had very little knowledge of her at that point. And it's called The Joys and Sorrows of a 19th Century Quaker Woman. Researching women is often more difficult than researching men because they didn't have jobs and they didn't have property always. So I've just put this bit here because she had 3 names. And in doing my research, it was really important that I stuck to those dates and knew and made sure that I did it. And you'll see later on that there's somebody else who was doing research and perhaps didn't appreciate that the name had changed. We'll see when we get to it. So here we are. We'll get started. My father-in-law, John Richard Evens, who died 20 years ago, had a huge book with loads of family names in it. I called it the Big Book. This is the entry, the bottom bit is the entry for John Tawell and Sarah Cutforth, previously Appleby. That's all there is. It doesn't mention his first marriage or her first marriage or their children by their previous marriages. And this was because very little was known about it, him and her. I'll just look at the top just to show that the Quaker ones in the book, if anybody's ever interested and wants to get in touch, include, these are the Quaker ones, Harrison Hills and Ansell from Essex. And I've put Dine in red because some of you may have known Mary Dine, who was a very active member, I gather, of this society some time ago, before she died. And she and my husband, who has the middle name Dine, are both descended from William Dine, who was a drummer boy in the Navy and was rescued by Peter Bedford and became a Quaker in the mid-19th century. Anyway, moving on to Sarah now. Nicholas and I, about 20 years ago, started looking at the real fact, what we thought were the real facts about John Tawell, rather than the sensational bits in the newspaper. And we noticed online, on the Quaker Forum, that somebody was asking whether there were any descendants of John Tawell because she was doing a book about him. And we were very suspicious and we ignored it. But 2 years later, Nicholas was in Friends House Library, and as he signed in, saying that he was researching John Tawell, the librarian said, there's somebody else in the library at the moment who's doing research on the same person. So they were introduced. And it was Carol Baxter, who is an Australian genealogist and writes an author. And she'd just been in England for 7 days. This was her last day. She was about to go to the airport, and she couldn't believe her luck that she was actually meeting, finally, one of the descendants of John Tawell. Nicholas was, as usual, quite cautious, and he gave her a little test. He said, she didn't know this was at the time. She realised afterwards. She said, oh, yes, he was born in 1784. And she immediately said, oh, no, it was 1783. I've been and I've seen the baptism record. So that gave us some confidence that she knew what she was doing, and we have corresponded with her. And the book she produced was 2013. You can get it very cheaply. If you really want to know the story of John Tawell, then that's the book about him. That's his biography. But once she was doing that, there was absolutely no point in us carrying on with John Tawell anymore. And I decided to deal with Sarah. And in those days, I know it's only about 10 or 11 years ago, Ancestry did not have the Quaker records. So short of going to all the local archives, it was going via BMD registers and looking for RG6. And then going to the genealogist site and paying per view, or £38 for 6 months. And I spent half an hour debating whether I was going to pay £38 for 6 months, because really I didn't even know if the Sarah Tawell that I was finding on that site was the right one. She might not have been a Quaker at all, as far as we knew, but it was money well spent, because by the end of the evening, I had been able to trace her ancestry right back to the first Appleby Quaker in the family, Lawrence Appleby, in Darlington. And Darlington, if you are lucky enough to have descendants there, have got some fantastically clear records. So it was very easily, often with 3 generations all on the same page. All the names in black and bold are Quakers. So apart from her father here, Edward, they were all Quakers. He broke the continuity, I have to say, for various reasons. And where it's got W in, their will is on the Quaker Faith, the site, QFHS site, already there. And there may be more to come. So her father was a bit of a character, I think. He was a mariner in North Shields. He became bankrupt and married a non-Quaker, and so was no longer Quaker. He was disowned. So when Sarah was born, he wasn't a Quaker, neither was his wife. I've just put this in very, very quickly to show how annoying it is when you have to go to the civil records, or rather the church records, and you don't get the parents. This is the only record I can find for Edward Appleby and his wife Elizabeth that could be right. And there are various reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But it would have been so nice if he'd had his parents listed there as well. So their first child was born in Gateshead in 1787, which is south of the River Tyne. And then Jonathan and Joshua boys were born in South Shields, further along the river, the South Tyne, south of the Tyne. Then there were 3 daughters, Susanna, Hannah, 4 rather, Elizabeth and Sarah, who were all born in North Shields on the other side. It was quite a busy port at that time. Sarah was the youngest of all of these. And quickly going over the Quaker records, which you will be familiar with, most of you, there were 3 of them for Sarah, apart from all the dates and the name. It gives her father as a shopkeeper at that point. This one is interesting. It says parents not in membership. And all the children, all the Edward and Elizabeth children are listed in the Quaker records, but they either have parents not in membership or parents not in unity with them. But thank goodness they're there, because at least it's a record. And this is another one that you will often see, where the person who was present at the birth, P. Watson, surgeon, and Mary Brown, the midwife, no doubt. The next records we pick up are when she went to Ackworth School. This is online, luckily, the catalogue for Ackworth. So I was able to find that both she and her sister were both at Ackworth. Elizabeth, her elder sister, was only there for a year, from 1812 to 1813, and Sarah was there from 1813 to 1816. I don't know if anybody else here tonight went on the visit to Ackworth School Archives. I think it was 2018. Quaker Family History Society organised it. And I'm very grateful, because for a start, I was able to take a photograph of Elizabeth's sampler. Very boring compared with most of the other samplers there, I have to say. There are some splendid samplers well stored at Ackworth. And if you want to know about what it was like at Ackworth School, Elfriede Vipont's book is extremely helpful. I think when Sarah was there, she had a very good education. There was a mother and daughter who seemed to be very good. And while we were there on that visit, they had the big ledger of all the pupils that had ever arrived at Ackworth. And this is what it said for Sarah. Sarah Appleby, school number 3465, arrived by coach in 1813 from Coalbrookdale, Shropshire, and departed by coach in 1816 to North Shields via Wentworth. Well, Coalbrookdale is 220 miles now south of North Shields for a start. She obviously hadn't gone there for the weekend. What was she doing in Coalbrookdale before going to Ackworth? Well, luckily, I had done quite a lot of other research, and I knew that her aunt, Susanna Appleby, was living in Coalbrookdale. So I am assuming that Sarah had gone to stay with her. And I know that Susanna had actually been to Ackworth in its early days. She had visited. She was a Quaker minister and travelled. So I think that's what happened. But in order to be a bit more sure, I went back a couple of generations. And it's quite necessary. I know there's a lot of writing on here. I do apologise, but it helps me, and my sight is bad, so jumping from paper to screen is difficult. But if I go back to her grandparents, Joshua and Anne Appleby, who lived in Durham, had 3 children. The third was born after Joshua died. He died very young. And soon afterwards, his widow married Joshua Hopper and moved out of Durham City to a little hamlet called Tersdale, which is just a few miles south of Durham City. You can actually see it if you're on the LNER railway. You can see Tersdale on a building now. And then she has several more children before she died a few years later. So my guess is that actually the 3 children from that first 3 children either stayed in Durham with their aunt and grandmother, or they went there when their mother died. But whatever they did, when they got to late teens, 20s, something had to be done for them. And this is where the Quaker networks came in, because there wasn't much money around. The oldest one went to work as a housekeeper for Richard Bush, who was a Quaker merchant in London. And things did not turn out well. She married a fellow Quaker who was on the staff of Richard Bush's house, and she was pregnant at the time, so she was disowned. They had to marry before a priest. And she moved to London, and I think their life was not very pleasant. I think it was really quite difficult. Edward, their second child, who was Sarah's father, went to Tyneside, did his own thing, became a mariner, owner of ships, bankrupted, as I said before. But the younger one, Susanna, had a very, very different life. And as she was important in Sarah's life, this is why I wanted to talk about her. She went to be companion to Sarah Darby, who was one of the daughters, one of the children of Abiah Darby and Abraham Darby, the ironmasters. She went in the 1770s and she stayed there till she died in 1828. And by all accounts, from all the diaries that the Abiah and Deborah Darby kept, she was very much as a member of the family. So much so that when Sarah Darby died in 1821, she left Susanna the use of two houses. This is one of them. If you've been to Coalbrookdale, you'll have seen these Georgian houses near the furnace, and their contents, 4,000 guineas in gold and 100 guineas per annum, which is a huge amount. A few years later, Susanna died, and her will is the longest will that I've ever seen. I have transcribed it, but I can't face analysing it because so many people were left money, including her brother, Edward, that's Sarah's father. She left him so much per week, but only to be paid by Robert Spence, the Quaker in North Shields. She didn't trust him. And this is what set me thinking that Sarah's family was not actually all that stable, as you might say these days. And one of the things that we are lucky with Quakers is that they wrote letters, and what's more, they kept them. So there's just 3 excerpts here about Susanna's father. Just look at, you only need to look at the red bits, really. One was written well before he married, as he was a young man, and it's his mother's cousin who's writing this. Had his education and knowledge of polished life been equal to his natural endowments, he would have been a very shining man, implying that he wasn't. And then Susanna, writing to her aunt about her brother, I have never heard from Edward, nor do I expect to hear anything comfortable. And then we move another, 14 years later, she says, I've heard nothing from Edward. Perhaps he is offended with me for my plain dealing. If so, I could wish him to come too, for I have not yet thought it my place. Sarah was 5 at this time, and I suspect that by the time the years went on, she got pretty desperate and arranged for the girls to go to Ackworth. I have no proof of that, of course, but that is my idea. So when Sarah left Ackworth to go back to North Shields to her family, she arrived to find that her brother, Jonathan, he was in financial difficulties. The oldest of the family, Edward, died in 1817, and I can't find anything about how he died, except a notice in the newspaper. Better news was that the 3 girls then got married. Susanna married Edward Ward, and that seems to have been very stable. And in fact, some of their children come back into the Quaker fold later on. Her sister Elizabeth married John Scott in Coalbrookdale because she was living with her Aunt Susanna in Coalbrookdale before she got married. And John Scott's sister lived there. So that was that network working. And they moved to London where he was in business. And then Sarah gets married in 1825. She has, in the ledger, the minutes of Peel monthly meetings show that she became a member before she got married, and married a man called William Cutforth, a friend. If anybody's got Thistlethwaite in their family tree, and some of the Yorkshire people will, then her maiden name was Thistlethwaite. And he was living in Clerkenwell at the time and presumably a friend of Elizabeth and John Scott. He was originally from Wensleydale, and it's important to remember that he had a business in Leighton Buzzard before he moved to London. And this is where the spoons come in. Johnny probably will talking about this before and put it on YouTube. Just briefly, my brother-in-law, Geoffrey, went into residential care last year. And one of our nieces took a photograph of everything in the house and sent it to us. And I had a quick look at it. And because it was a photo, I was able to enlarge this spoon. These initials are only a centimetre across. If I looked at it in a drawer, I probably wouldn't have noticed what it said. But I really wanted it to say W, S and C, William, Sarah, and William and Sarah Cutforth. At that point, I hadn't got the hallmark. I gave a presentation to part of the family, and a cousin jumped up and she said, I've got a spoon just like that with that initials. And she sent me the hallmark, and they are the same. And it's a Newcastle assay mark for 1825. So as they were married in 1825, my guess is that they were actually made for their wedding. I have no proof, but I think it is, and it's quite a nice little story. So we started with one. Sally Evens had another one, and then another cousin said, oh, she got two more. So we've got four with that in now. So for the next few years, I'm dependent completely on Quaker records. First of all, her marriage. Within weeks of them getting married, William was made bankrupt. There are a lot of minutes in Peel Monthly Meeting about visits made to and from him and reporting back. They decided that they were actually, he wasn't disowned because they said it was his mistake that he had too much stock, but his partner had let him down. So they really had some faith in him, and he wasn't disowned. But because he was bankrupt and he owed a lot of money, actually, they moved from Clerkenwell to somewhere cheaper in Whitechapel, and he had to get an ordinary job. But 2 years later, you'll see that she suffered two bereavements within 5 weeks. The first was her aunt Susanna, who had been very caring for her. And although she and Sarah and her sister Elizabeth were the residuary legacies of Susanna's will, I have no idea how much that was. I can't find out. But it must have been quite a lot in the will because, yes, there was quite a lot, but I don't know how much, or how much came to Sarah and Elizabeth. And then just over a month later, her husband died, was buried at Quakers Bunfield Fields. And she was pregnant at this point. So her daughter was born early in the next year at the home of her sister and brother-in-law in Clerkenwell. The next two are removal notices. And how useful these are, because you can follow people around the country. The 1834 one we'll come back to. I know exactly what that was about. This one was a puzzle till a few weeks ago. In 1829, she and her daughter moved from Peel Monthly Meeting to Albans Monthly Meeting. And I haven't missed out the saints. Quakers didn't use Saint for St Albans. They missed it out. And they moved to Hemel Hempstead. And I decided to have a bit of fun. And what I did was went to Google, and I had a bit of a play, and this is what I found. So this is about an issue about filling the gap. This plaque is on this building here, 25 High Street, and it's Joseph Cranstone. He had an ironmongery shop and later an iron foundry, and his son and he supplied many major items for the town, including this bridge here. And not surprisingly, of course, the connection with Coalbrookdale was they got their iron from the Derby family. This is the building as it is today. It has a nightclub in the basement, apparently. It's a very large house. So I knew that I could see that Joseph Cranstone had also been at Ackworth after Sarah, before Sarah, but after her husband. But he hadn't been there at the same time. And he'd married in 1820 and they had 15 children altogether. By the time Sarah moved to Hemel Hempstead, this family had 5 or 6 children and many more. And I think probably even if Sarah wasn't living with them, she taught their children. Because what happens is that in 1834, she moves to Berkhamsted and she founds a school. So I think friends supported her. And then I did the sensible thing and went back to the records and looked at her removal thing from Peel Monthly Meeting in 1829. I noticed that after that, it says widow of William. And I thought, why did they put William in there? And then I realised that William had lived for several years before his move to London in Leighton Buzzard. And Leighton Buzzard is only 16 miles from Hemel Hempstead. And I've concluded that actually it was his friends that helped Sarah after he died. It wasn't her own family, it was him. So thank goodness for those Quakers who came on board and helped her. And this is the one where she's moved to Berkhamsted, to Upper Side Monthly Meeting, and sent to Joseph Cranstone, actually, of Hemel Hempstead. So now we're in 1834, and she moves to this house here. This is a picture taken, drawn, and in the Railway Bell magazine in about 10 years later. And this is, the bottom one is a historic England listing. It's now called the Red and White House and is in Berkhamsted, as you can see. I'd like you to take note of some dates now, because this is Pigot's directory for 1839. And Sarah's school is listed there, English and French. She's the only one who does French. Where she learnt French, I don't know, because French wasn't taught at Quaker officially at the time she was there, but who knows. And there are several schools on Berkhamsted High Street at the time, which is quite interesting. On this picture at the top left, I am very embarrassed about, because I didn't have a decent camera with me at friend's house. It appeared one year. You know how you should keep looking back at archives and searching, because this particular cart about prospectus for her school didn't appear till about 4 or 5 years ago, and yet I've been looking for many years before that, and I suspect that it hadn't been catalogued. This is a transcription of, sorry, there we are, of the fees and what she taught and how many sheets they had to be provided for. Friends House Library, the card simply says 1835 with a question mark, so I think that was their guess. But the real key to my dating here is this on the left-hand corner from the Quaker Annual Monitor. And it's about the sisters, Sarah and Maria de Horn, who, these twin sisters, in the 10th month of 1835, were placed under the care of Sarah Cutforth at her boarding school, Berkhamsted Hearts, and there continued to enjoy an uninterrupted state of good health until the 10th of the 2nd month, 1836, when Sarah was taken ill with what proved to be scarlet fever, and indeed Maria did too, and they both died, which must have been tragic. But looking up, I think there was a lot of illnesses around at that time, and certainly the Mount School, as it was in, well, it was Friends School in York, where I was, not at that time, I have to say, much later, they had a lot of illness too. And then I very recently found this one here in Bedfordshire Archives, Nancy May writing to her sister in 1837, saying, S. Cutforth is in town and gives a good account of our dear girls. So 1835, 1837 and 1839 shows that she had this school. I'll come back to that in a minute when we get to 1839. I need to give you a brief history of her husband who appears on the scene in 1839 or 1840, well after she's got her school established. I've taken it mainly from British Quakers in Commerce and Industry, which I know a lot of you will be very familiar with. Ted Milligan actually had a soft spot for this story, and he writes about it in one of his books. And when we asked him, why on earth did you put John Tawell into this book of British Quakers in Commerce and Industry when he was only a Quaker for a year? And he said, well, I rather like the story. So there we are. So we know that he was born in 1783, though a lot of sources say 1784, which is wrong. He worked for a Quaker pharmacist in London, and because of that became a member of the Religious Society of Friends in 1807. And a year later, he was disowned for marrying out. And they had 2 sons. A few years later, and these are only a few of the things he did, I have to say, the standout ones. He attempted to forge banknotes against the Quaker Bank of Uxbridge. Now, this was a capital offence at the time. So the Quakers decided that they asked for him to be charged with a lesser charge of carrying forged notes, which they did. And he was found guilty and sentenced to transportation to Australia. And he really made use of that time in Australia. He became a businessman. He became the registered pharmacist in Australia. He sold exotic goods, and he got in with all the best people and bought land, and apparently came home eventually with £40,000, so the story says. But he was there by himself. Meanwhile, in those early years, he was there for 10 years while Quakers in London were looking after his wife and sons. And when they heard that he was making money, they saved up and they to send the family out to join him, which they did. The younger son died in England in 1833. John and Mary returned in 1830s due to his health, and she died in 1838. After his wife's death, John Tawell had a relationship with her nurse, Sarah Hart. Her real name was Hadler, but she took the name Hart for some reason. And they had 2 children in 1840 and 1841. He didn't live with them, never lived with them, but he did provide for them. And he tried several times to become a member of Quakers, but always failed. How he met Sarah Cutforth is open for debate. Some say that he took a niece to maybe go to her school, but his only nieces weren't Quakers, and also they weren't the right age. And neither Carol Baxter, the writer of the book, or I have actually been able to find any evidence for that. I think he probably heard about this woman who had some money and had a big house, and he went up to Berkhamsted to meet her. Of course, I don't know that. Now, I've put this in here because it is an illustration of how you can have different interpretations of a life or what happened in a life. And another much younger member of the family, I think it's in John's branch of the family, John Gurney's, who is on here tonight, when she heard about this story, became interested, as we all do, and got in touch with Kate Dawson, who runs podcasts in America. And 6 14-minute podcasts were made about the story of John Tawell and various contributions, historical facts, and Carol Baxter was involved as well. And I listened to all of them twice, hoping actually to see if I could find any more about Sarah. But the 2 things stuck out to me was that Sarah Tawell came from a good Quaker family. And I think that's not quite true. I think if you delve further, that maybe her ancestors were good Quakers, but her actual immediate family was quite troubled. And then when John Tawell met Sarah Appleby in 1839, she was setting up a school for young girls. And he was very supportive of his wife's venture. But of course, she'd actually been running it definitely since 1835. And I've got very fond of Sarah, as I've researched her. I feel very strongly that she should be given credit for what she did of setting up her own school and looking after her daughter and making a success of the school. So moving on, what happened next is that they decided to get married. Her friends were not happy about this and dissuaded her, and she broke off the engagement. But then it went on again. He persuaded her, and they had to get married at the registry office, not before a priest actually, but at the registering office, and she was disowned. Anyway, so she was no longer a Quaker officially. But I'm sure from letters and from other things that she did actually continue going with John to Berkhamsted meeting for worship, and very sociably, because there are mentions of Quakers' involvement. Rather than the school carrying on, it actually was closed. The kitchen garden was converted to a pleasure garden. Sarah's daughter Eliza was sent off to London to Elizabeth Sweetapple School. John kept acquiring more land and property, as he had done in Australia, and he appointed himself joint surveyor of highways in Berkhamsted and made many enemies. So much so that in the Bucks Gazette there are several letters written using the pseudonym Miles's boy, really horrible letters criticising his actions and suggesting that John Tawell was using funds for his own purposes, which of course may well have been true, but were never proved. And Sarah, I don't know how she coped with all of this, because she had before that been extremely well regarded before his appearance. But she got an occasional mention in the paper as well, which is really rather sad. John's son died in 1843, aged 33. So both his sons had died by then. But he had this Tawell, the son, had a wife. And John, the senior, was actually providing for her. And we come across that later. And very happy event in 1843. Henry Augustus Tawell was born, son of Sarah and John, and great-grandfather of Nicholas. And by all accounts, grew up to be a splendid man with a splendid family, which we'll come to later. And this letter, written in January the 1st, 1845, is very poignant. I'll stop fairly shortly, just in case there are any questions, because I haven't seen the chat. Her life changed on this day, as did his. He'd gone off to London, saying that he wanted to investigate his Australian affairs, the money. And he was worried, quite rightly, because it was midsummer in Sydney and there was a drought and the economy was awful and his shares were going down. And she knows this. And she writes him a letter. She knows he's going to stay. He goes to the Jerusalem Coffee House is where he has his letters. So she's been thinking about him. Then there's a lot of domestic stuff, and friends have called. Friends have called for her and for her daughter. And she wants to know what the Sydney papers are saying. In fact, she finishes up with, "I think I could bear up better if the whole burden was on me alone, but that is impossible. I do hope, my dear husband, you will bear up. The year has opened with a lovely day. I hope it is an omen of the future which awaits us. Farewell, under every circumstance, thy beloved wife." And because of what he did next, that was published in practically every newspaper in the land. So what was he doing on that day? Well, he did take the train to London, as he said, went to a chemist shop, bought prussic acid, i.e. cyanide. In the afternoon, he went to Slough on the train to Bath Place in Salt Hill, where he'd got his mistress living and with her 2 children. It is alleged that he actually had tried to kill her before, but this time he succeeded. Her neighbour heard Sarah screaming, found her ill on the floor, and she died. John Tawell made his escape to Slough Station and caught the train for Paddington. But he had been spotted, and he was wearing a long so-called Quaker coat and a cap, a hat, a flat hat. And the station manager realised that he could send a message by this new electric telegraph, which would reach Paddington before the train did. So he decided to send a message. And he was asked to say that a man of a certain age, dressed in Quaker garb, would arrive on the train. Well, this is this electric telegraph, and it's built on the Wheatstones Bridge, and there was only room for 20 letters, and neither Q or U appear on it, so they had to apparently say Kwaker. And it reached Paddington, and a policeman was waiting for him, didn't arrest him at that point, followed him he was staying at a Quaker lodging house, and he was arrested the next day and taken to Slough. This is the next 3 months, and I'll stop after this for a breather. January to March 1845. He was arrested, taken to Slough, and he was allowed to write a letter to his wife. Unfortunately, it arrived after she'd read of his arrest in a newspaper report. Quite what she thought about it, I do not know. It must have been awful. But she got on a train and went off to Slough to see him. The story was picked up because of the electric telegraph involvement, and every day until the end of March, it was reported in great detail, especially in the Times, and then syndicated to the rest of the country. John's younger brother, William, of Earl's Colne, was a great support of Sarah, and he came over and helped her. He was the salt of the earth. He had a very good business in Earl's Colne. He was very well respected. He was the postmaster, and he became a trustee for John. He is my hero and hero of the story. Through the next few weeks, Sarah and Eliza visited several times, and so did a lot of Quakers, some very upset that a Quaker, because they called him a Quaker, even though he really wasn't, had been arrested for murder, and some feeling that maybe he hadn't, because if he was a Quaker, he wouldn't have done. Well, who knows? And it looks as though her sister visited too, from a newspaper report. The trial was in the middle of March. It only lasted 3 days. His defence lawyer was Sir Fitzroy Kelly. And because Sir Fitzroy Kelly used as a defence the fact that Sarah Hart, the mistress, ate a lot of apples which had cyanide in the pips, maybe that was the cause of death. Of course, it didn't stand up. But his name afterwards, his nickname afterwards, Appleby Kelly. So John was found guilty of the murder of Sarah Hart, sentenced to death, and executed in public with a huge crowd on March the 28th, 1845. And it was not a neat execution. If you want to read about that, read the book. Right, I think I'm just going to stop share for a minute now, just to see if there are any questions. And as I say, just have a breather and just have a quick drink. And I don't see any chats at the moment. Are there any chats, Pat?
I haven't seen anything in the chat, but if anybody wants to ask a question, if you want to put your camera on again and either wave or put the hand icon up, then I will have a look and see.
Joan Harvey.
Joan, sorry.
Thank you. I couldn't access the chat while the screen was on, which is why you haven't.
Yeah.
That might explain. Anyway, it has just occurred to me. My husband was at Berkhamsted School, and we went there on a weird little visit on the way back home the other week when we'd been to see David's aunt in London. And there is a girls' school still on Berkhamsted High Street. I wondered if there was any link in that you might know of.
I don't know it, no. And no, I don't. And it may be that when Sarah was, when it happened, and she was no longer a Quaker, maybe, and the school stopped, it may have been, as my son pointed out, it may have been because Quakers wouldn't send them to school at all. I don't know, Joan. It may have been one of the other schools that continued. But yes.
Quite old buildings. Yes, quite old buildings.
Yeah. Where there was a garden at the time is now a car park, I believe. Well, I'll certainly take questions at the end. I've drawn breath now, and we can move on to what happened after and then move on to much happier times when she was able to take charge of her own life and make decisions and do well. So I hope you can see now, and please don't read it all because there's an awful lot there. This is what she was faced with, and his brother, William, who was her trustee, and Mr. Goodeve, who was her solicitor. These are his assets. But look at this one, the shares. You see, they're only half the value of what he bought. So no wonder he was worried. We'll come back to the numerous Australian holdings later on. And he had he bought up stuff in Berkhamsted as well. And then there's these debts. Somehow, the cost of his defence had to be paid for. There were arrears for his daughter-in-law, which she was supposed to pay. Obligations, £60 per annum from then on, which I think she managed to reduce to £40. How she paid it at this point, I cannot think. But she also agreed to pay for the upkeep of his mistress's 2 children, which I think was regarded as being very generous at the time, and well, it was generous. The girl died soon afterwards, and the boy seems to have disappeared from records. I suspect he left England and went to a better life somewhere else. They had been living with Sarah Hart's parents. So it's very complicated, all of that, and it must have been just awful trying to make sense of it. And in fact, it was another 2 years before there was a Crown Commission to decide what should happen, whether Sarah should get any money back at all. So there's a jury of 12 men, and the commissioners and the solicitor and her solicitor, and I'm sure that William was there as well. And Sarah apparently was the only woman there. And the Observer says, Mrs. Sarah Tawell was then led into the room by Mr. Goodeve, that's her solicitor. She appeared very much affected and was accommodated with a chair. She was dressed as a Quakeress in a black silk dress with white crepe shawl and a black satin bonnet. She deposed that she was the only attesting witness. She then left the room in tears. I went to Hertford, the archives, I took that picture, that's how it looks today. And the document that was signed by Queen Victoria is a huge vellum document. I don't think he'd been out for years. And when I unfolded it, it wasn't really fragile. It was just frightening to actually unfold it. And it was as big as the table that I was laying it out on. Anyway, Queen Victoria did agree. The Crown Commission did agree that she should get money back and she could start making her own decisions again. And just as I also copied out the inventory of the house when it was taken just after he was arrested. And it comes to 2 sides when I transcribe 2 sides of A4 in very small type. And the first bit is all about the things he brought back from America, with Australia, glass cases, lots of birds and fish. And yes, this thing, yes. So I've put them in red because in a book written by Nick's aunt, Isabel, she visited her grandparents' house in 1920, and she said in the hall was a tall glass-fronted mahogany case which held stuffed birds and animals. So presumably they had come down via Sarah to Henry Augustus and on. So that was just a bit of light relief. I don't know where they are now, whether they're with family somewhere else, who knows. So in 1849, Sarah, Henry and Eliza moved to Essex. This is a very sensible move on at least 2 counts. One is with the name Tawell, which was all over the country in the newspapers as belonging to a murderer, going to Earl's Cohen, where her brother-in-law, William Tawell, was very well respected, was good. And he did look after her. For a start, her daughter Eliza married one of William's sons, Samuel. He was a lace manufacturer from London, but they married at the Independent Dissenters Meeting House in Fearing. I haven't been able to find out anything else about that, but that's what the certificate says. They went to live in London, had 4 daughters. They had a lodging house too, and quite often there were Quakers who stayed there from various parts of the country. And Samuel was a very upright man. He was an active volunteer at the Field Lane Refuge in the East End. Sarah's son, Henry Augustus, was taught by his mother. This is what Ted Milligan tells me. Ted Milligan has a file in Friend's house that you can look up about people. And later he was educated at Earl's Cohen Free Grammar School, which wasn't free at all. It had fees. And then he became apprenticed to a Quaker farmer, I don't know who, as a seed grower. Henry was really well looked after by his Tawell cousins. Henry had been told that his father had died before he was born. But in his teens, a visitor told him how his father had died and what he'd done. And according to one of Henry's sons, he was so upset that he actually didn't want to live any longer. He was physically ill. But luckily, he had the family around him. And in fact, he had his mother, who was very, really looked after him. You'll see that in a minute. We were talking about Earl's Cone Meeting House earlier on, and there are people here on the Zoom tonight who are members today. This is from David Butler's book. That's what it probably looked like when Sarah was there. And this is what it looks like in more modern times. I don't know how many people are aware of the religious census in 1851, but we did it at one of my family history group classes. So I put it in here because it shows that 11 Quakers were present at the morning meeting for worship in 1851 on that day, 30th March, and 10 in the afternoon. Whereas at the Baptist Chapel, which is where the Tawell family went, there were 168 in the morning and 250 in the afternoon. But it's interesting that Sarah, although she was kind of rescued by the Tawell family who were Baptists, she remained a Quaker. And it may be that she wanted her son to be a Quaker. And that lasts some photos. I haven't got a date for these because they came electronically. That's Sarah in her younger days. I suspect it was at the same time as this one. You can work out for yourself how old he was. He was born in 1843. So it was in the early 50s maybe. And that's her. Henry Rowntree is descended from Henry Augustus's eldest daughter, Gertrude, which we'll come to perhaps a bit later on. "15 years after John Tawell was executed, finally, the arrangements for selling all his land in Australia were completed. It was a very complicated case because they'd never had anything like it before, of somebody being whose land was cheated in England, and yet some of it was in Australia. And the Great Seal case, it was a very special case, and it's pages long on the web. The colonial secretary was deputed to sort it out. And he did. He realised some of the money, but promptly ran off with it to California. So whether they ever got it back, I don't know. But some of the proceeds did come, and Sarah used it to buy up land near Earl's Cone. Earl's Cone is, I might be corrected by this, it's west of Colchester in Essex, and Wakes Cone is a few miles away. I did have a map on here and I haven't got it on today, I'm sorry. But the National Archives records tell me that she started, these are the pieces of land she bought up in Wakes Cone, with these lovely names: Frosts, Orchard Gardens, Little Row, Meadow Plot, Cobsleys, Potters, Long Row, Veals Mutton, Stoneheads, Greenfield and Mother's Field. In 1980, oh, that's a misprint. Sorry, I only did that earlier on today. In 1870, Sarah took her son, Henry, as a pre-wedding trip to Paris. And then in June, he married Maria Harrison. Notice the double S, that is correct. It's been dropped a bit now, of the Quaker Harrison Hills family. Apparently, her family were a bit dubious about this, marrying into a murderer's family. But it was a very long and happy marriage, by all accounts. And a farmhouse was built for Henry and Maria. It was called Patrick's Farm in Wakes Cone. This is a picture of the farmhouse taken in the early 20th century. Here, which are not in this picture, there's a lovely circular lawn. And here is the same house today from the air, well, no, last year, from the air. The lawn is still there, but it looks a bit different because it's got a swimming pool and a tennis court. And it's now called Jupes Hill House, but it is the same house. And we have been in touch with the owners of the house now, the current owners, and sent them a history of the family who grew up there, the Tawell family who grew up there, which was interesting. And they told us that when they moved in, there was a photograph hanging in the hall of Henry and Maria's golden wedding, I think, and it had been left in the house. Every owner of the house had left it there as a memento of who had lived there. This is the house. Oh, in Upper Holt Street that Sarah lived in, but she only lived in half the house. It's the back bit. At that point, it was called Elm Cottage, but it was then extended by James, one of William's sons, after she died, and to make this really rather grand house. And it was built, and it was used as the manse for the Baptists. I don't know if Earls Cohenwood can tell me anymore whether it's still there and what it's used for, but it's rather a grand house. And some British listed buildings can be extremely useful for finding out more about buildings. So Sarah lived in that house till she died in 1884. In every census, she has young granddaughters staying with her, either through her husband's side or John Tawell's first family, his William Tawell's grandchildren, or her own ones from London. And I think she may have been teaching them. It would make sense that she was having her own little private school there. Henry, her son, was present at her death. On the death certificate, it says she's widow of John Tawell, gentleman. Well, depends how you interpret the word gentleman. Her estate was only £133. Presumably, she left all her money to her. All her money was being used by her son. So whether her son Henry was supporting her in her house or whether it was the Tawell family, I don't know. Her death was recorded in the Quaker Annual Monitor, and she was buried in Earls Cohen Quaker Burying Ground. And this is the stone. Jenny, who is here with us tonight, she sent me this photo a few years ago. And I do have another photo of Jenny, which was sent by Beryl Roundtree, was of a few years before that, which is a bit more complete, but it's sad to see it in that condition. Just a couple more slides before I stop. Henry and Maria had 11 children. They all lived to adulthood. Frank had polio as a child, so he was somewhat handicapped. The ones in bold were Quakers, definitely Quakers. John will probably tell me more about whether George was a Quaker at this time. I don't know whether the current descendants are. The only ones that I really know are still Quakers are descendants of Edith Maria and Frederick William, that is my husband's family. And Jenny, I am gathering some more information about this family for you, for Earls Cohen. And finally, when my brother-in-law's house was being cleared out, I was presented with 5 large scrapbooks of family photos. And the one that this picture here, Sarah Tawell, I had in fact seen, but only digitally. But this version was on a carte de visite. And so I took it out as carefully as I could. And this is what I interpret it saying. It says, my grandma, oh, I'm sorry, taught language. And I think that is inserted. I take it to be very fine character. And that was written, I think, by Nick's grandmother, who was herself the granddaughter of Sarah. I like that bit, saying something about her character, and certainly other writings we've had that she was a determined character. So for the first part of her life, she had a funny background, was rescued by her aunt. She married William, and he was bankrupted and left her with no money. She then provided for herself and her daughter as a school, married again, left with no money or has cheated property. And then when he died, she was able eventually to make her own life. I think she was a very shrewd woman, but we knew nothing about this except for the last 10 years. And just very finally, that big book I referred to at the beginning, I found a piece written by my father-in-law, Richard, who says, whether it was before or after her marriage to John Tawell, I am not clear, but Sarah Cutforth at that time kept a school. If she was at that time in membership, it is possible some historically minded person could throw some light on her. it would be interesting because not only John Tawell's characteristics, but Sarah Cutforth's must be among our genes. And for him, that would have been really important. And I'm just so sad that I couldn't share the story of not just Sarah being an upright, sensible, shrewd woman, but that her ancestors and that particular line went back to quite radical Quaker in Darlington. So at this point, I will stop share. There we are.